It's a pleasure to welcome the Permanent Representative of Philippines to the United Nations Office at Geneva and Convention on Cluster Munitions 13 MSP President Carlos D. Soreta for this Meet the Makers podcast discussion, where we talk with global disarmament stakeholders and look at how the Convention on Cluster Munitions contributes to peace, security, and development goals. Ambassador, a very warm welcome. Can you please share with us your professional background and how you came to take up the CCM 13 MSP presidency?
Oh, thank you very much, Jared. Glad to be here with you. I started out on disarmament, my first assignment in New York in the 90s, and quickly saw there were vital national interests for the Philippines to join all those who are pushing for disarmament and international humanitarian law. So I did the disarmament committee. I was rapporteur and then subsequently vice chair, vice president, also vice president of the conference, the disarmament commission, several other bodies, also on the bureau. We one of the resolutions I personally first handled was on the one on nuclear testing, and then subsequently in 1996 I was one of the Philippine Council in the International Court of Justice on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. And it's been since then, yes, been pretty active. I've been in every review conference for the NPT since 1995. And even though I was assigned in bilateral posts, the IHL and disarmament hat never really came off. It's influenced a lot of my work in other fields.
Thank you. Indeed, you mentioned your work with ICC, and absolutely the first thing that came to my mind was just sort of the links with the convention and international humanitarian law. So certainly lots of connection there with your previous work. At the recent CCM meeting of states parties in September, where you assumed the treaty leadership, a number of speakers mentioned the convention as a critical tool for advancing IHL, among other key contributions. What is the interest of the Philippines holding the presidency, or how does the Philippines see the CCM and humanitarian disarmament overall?
My interest in IHL started very early. In the 90s, we were talking about, in the UN, personal landmines and small arms. But as in any country, we had to convince our defense establishment that there should be limits on the weapons they are allowed to use. And I was tasked to brief top leadership of our defense establishment. And eventually they did agree that although part of their battle strat tactics was to have landmines to protect their because we have an internal armed conflict, and it's a very asymmetrical type of conflict where you don't really have fixed bases, you move around a lot, and you're always subject to unconventional attacks. And they always thought that landmines was very important to protect their perimeters. They did finally agree, but the general I was talking to, an old grizzled veteran of Korea and Vietnam, he said, "Okay, we will allow you to limit how we wage war as long as you diplomats do your work and prevent war in the first place." So that was the deal. But then later on, when we started building a peace process, the military acknowledged that it was good that they observe humanitarian law because it was easier to discuss peace with the other side. That if they had continued using, for example, landmines, and there was a lot of civilian casualties, a lot of children being hurt, and that affected the local communities, so they can't farm, it would have been much more difficult to engage in a peace process. So in the end, they said, you know, it was the right thing. You follow international maritime law, and the road to peace will be a little easier. So I guess that's why we're very much into believing in IHL.
Thank you. I realize I'm mixing around the questions a bit,
Go ahead.
partly because your responses are so interesting. Can you please talk a little bit more about the role of Philippines in contemporary disarmament discussions?
Well, I'll do more than that. I'll do a bit less. I'll even go back to history. The first ever General Assembly resolution, General Assembly number 1, was a resolution that was initiated by some countries, including the Philippines, and this was on nuclear weapons. At that time, the start of the Cold War, the great superpower rivalry, the greatest danger, existential threat the world felt was nuclear weapons. So ever since then, we've been an advocate for disarmament and, of course, humanitarian law. It was a bit difficult throughout the Cold War because we were very closely aligned with a major nuclear power, and many considered us, we did have bases, and many considered us under the nuclear umbrella, protection of the United States. But since the bases left, we've been during the Cold War, we anchored our security on an alliance, choosing one side. You know, it's a very divided world.
Mm-hmm.
But after the Cold War, we decided to anchor our security on multilateralism, on regional dialogue, on building trust and understanding. Of course, we always do maintain a strong, as much as possible, military posture, as well as maintain our alliance, military alliance, mutual defense alliance with the United States. But we've shifted a little more into the more contemporary means, which is building strong relations, not being enemies to anyone, trying to be friends to everyone.
Thank you. Just repeating a couple of standout points you mentioned, so important when you're talking about IHL as a tool for peace, and indeed with discussions internally with the Philippine military. And the last point you just mentioned, Philippines anchoring security in multilateralism. I think that's...
Which is, of course, under siege these days.
Which is
Suffering.
under siege. Yeah, extremely important that be mentioned, and so thank you for that. Ambassador, this year will be an important one. Philippines has just taken on the presidency of the Convention on Cluster Munitions. The convention community is undertaking planning for the 2026 Third Review Conference. What are the priorities for the Philippine presidency and why?
The priority is always to uphold international humanitarian law, even in the face of its massive violations. We need to... One of the biggest ironies of international humanitarian law is it takes tragic events that states have to witness the tragedy of war, the inhumanity of war, before they actually sit down and write out a treaty to address those horrendous and humanitarian challenges. It's really an irony because you usually want to set up the positive norms to prevent these things, but throughout the history of mankind, they've had to experience it first. They had to be gassed first. They had to suffer from poison arrows. They had to, or laser blinding weapons and landmines, and then the world gets together. Oh no, we should not be doing. So it's a supreme irony. I think one of the great challenges we need once we do set these humanitarian norms in stone, we need to uphold it. We need to observe it, and there are still coming humanitarian challenges in terms of norms. For example, artificial intelligence and lethal autonomous weapons. And right now we're struggling to agree on those norms. But I have to make it clear that the norms on humanitarian law exist as customary, whether there's positive norms, they exist, but it's better to elaborate it and make sure that states become state parties so that it's clear what the obligations are on each state. And not only that, it's also clear when there is a breach by a state. So sometimes customary law arguments on disproportionality, on military use, utility, on excessive use. It's sometimes the the goalpost moves around, but when you enshrine it in a legally binding instrument, then it's very clear. You eliminate the gray areas. But like I said, the response is very late. So now that we have a positive, now that we have a lot of legally binding instruments, we have to do everything we can to make sure that we strengthen those norms. And two ways to do it is to promote universality, try to get more states to, and so second is try to prevent states from withdrawing or having very stretched interpretations. I concede that states will always act in their national interest. They will always maximize their interest there, particularly when security interests are involved. But we believe that, as always, there should be limitations on on how you are able, on what weapons you can use, what tactics you can use. Because, like I said, in the long run, it's better to observe international humanitarian law if your eventual objective is to have peace with your neighbors or the former enemies. It's much easier and it will be much more difficult if there's so many violations of humanitarian law. It's very hard to sit down and talk about ceasefire when there's so much hatred and so much anger from civilians who've been hurt, from civilian infrastructure that's been destroyed. So states need, they do. I don't understand that for the short term, they need to defend themselves, but in the long term, they have to live with their adversaries if they do engage in conflict. So, so it's, but beyond that strategic idea, we really have to encapsulate international humanitarian law about the persons. Civilians should never be targets. Prisoners, wounded soldiers should not be. It's by on its own merits, it should be upheld. I'm just looking at it from a broader perspective. But there's no excuse for for violating humanitarian law. I believe it is it's peremptory. It cannot be breached. There's no defense, actually. And the criminal court. Oh, I was also involved in the negotiations for the International Criminal Court, and much of this was also taken up because the negotiations for the International Criminal Court, the context of that was the conflict in Rwanda and Burundi and in the Balkans, when the Security Council had to set up special tribunals. But then they realized that we had to, the way to strengthen international humanitarian law is to actually have a structure by which these breaches can be addressed. So anything from genocide to the use of prohibited weapons was covered. As an aside, we tried to include nuclear weapons in the ICC, but didn't pass.
Thank you again. So interesting. You're talking about customary law already existing, international humanitarian law norms existing. Indeed, of course, we have just here in Geneva celebrated the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. These norms do exist, but as you point out, the Convention on Cluster Munitions and other treaties and conventions make this implementation much more feasible, possible, because, yes, I think you also mentioned implementation as they say, sort of the devil's in the details, and the implementation often is very difficult. So, thank you. Ambassador, what are some of the principal challenges today, considering the actual global context? Principal challenges for IHL and specifically for CCM, if you will, today?
Like I said, states, if they do decide to use armed force in terms of defending their territorial integrity, they would like to do it with victory in mind. And it's very hard for them to think that victory might be elusive if they're not allowed a certain weapon system. So that's the biggest challenge. In fact, the solution actually is to prevent conflict, and that's the message of the ICRC. They said that they hope to have, one day that they become irrelevant. So the work, and it's very challenging, is to maintain multilateralism as a landing zone for those who wish to resolve their conflicts. Those who are in armed conflict should know that they're not the solution is not a purely military one. That if they decide for peace, there are structures that can enforce that peace. That there are incentives for peace in the multilateral sphere. But like I said, it's CCM. Yeah, on CCM, that's the big challenge. It's a very cheap weapon. It gives very strong sense of security, although it has a very high failure rate. We have to create a world where IHL is not the last thing on the minds of generals when they wage war, or even the soldiers. That IHL guides them all the time. Like I said, it always takes a major tragedy in terms of war. The 49 conventions were only negotiated after 2 world wars. See, they only sat down after they had they saw this. They said, we have to. Another irony of international humanitarian laws. International law prohibits war under the UN Charter, Article 2, Paragraph 4. It's starting with with Gallup-Bryan Pact, but with the UN Charter, it's very clear. You can only use armed force for defensive reasons. You cannot use it. War is outlawed, but then that's on one. On the other hand, you have this massive body of laws that says if you are going into war, these are the rules that you have to do. It's almost saying you're not supposed to commit a crime, but if you do it, this is the way you conduct yourself. So it's full of ironies that reflect how the international system is really very different from our understanding of law and order in a domestic system.
Indeed. No, thank you for mentioning that. I was going to say, when you mentioned international law prohibits war for offensive purposes, and then you have a body of law that says, if that should happen, this must be followed. It's sort
like
of
saying you're not supposed to commit murder is illegal, but if you will commit murder, these are the rules.
Right? It's sort of
it's an irony.
Reflecting, as you say, the world reality.
The world reality is there is no hard and fast structure. Some people call it a chaotic situation where there's no structure for order except power.
I very much appreciate your comment. IHL cannot be the last option for generals or for soldiers, and sort of also maybe through education, other means, training, etc. That's this is an avenue.
It's being done. But when you're being shot at and you're trying to defend that position, sometimes the training on how to use your weapons take over almost automatically, rather than the classroom training on IHL.
Indeed. Ambassador, what key messages or message do you have for states parties as Philippines undertakes the the 13 MSP convention leadership, and for those states that are not party to the convention that may be considering joining the convention, what words would you have for them?
We are seeing today what happens when IHL is ignored. The images are jarring and traumatic. This is not the kind of, we concede that there will be conflict, but this is not the way we see the world. Even if in conflict, humanity must remain, even though you're shooting at each other. These rules need to be maintained and respected. Civilians on their own right need to be protected. Aid workers especially need to be protected by humanitarian law. And like I said, states need to realize that everyone wants peace and stability. When you agree to peace, you want it to be stable. You don't want a peace with a long history of violating or hurting civilians of either side, which can plant seeds for further conflict, ethnic conflict, cultural conflict. So there are many imperatives to strengthen international humanitarian law. Key message, of course, is we'd like state parties to help promote universality and make it clear to non-state parties that international humanitarian law benefits everyone. Does not seriously compromise military needs, and yeah, that's basically it. That's one of the most arguments. Some of these weapons have proven to be not truly beneficial for their military needs. Of course, the other side of that is more highly technically sophisticated weapons are replacing these weapons, but they're expensive. So we're worried about transfers. We don't want transfers to, for example, to Ukraine. And there's a pending transfer from the United States. We were not sure how the new president of the United States will address the Ukrainian situation. We've heard he doesn't want to spend any more money on arms for Ukraine.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your
You
comments
are welcome, John.
and your insights. You're in for your final comments on civilian protection at the core of the Convention on Cluster Munitions and this conversation today. Very prescient. Your note about preventing these civilian casualties as key to preventing further conflict. Also, wonderful message. And the notion that international humanitarian law benefits everyone. Thank you again, and
You are most welcome.
we look forward to continuing the conversation
Sure.
and picking up as
Wish us luck.
Philippines prepares for the 13 MSP and the third review conference. So wish you luck indeed, and I'm sure with much wisdom in addition to that luck. So
Thank you very much.
thank you. Again, you've been listening to the Meet the Makers podcast interview with Ambassador Carlos D. Soreta, permanent representative of the Philippines to the United Nations office at Geneva, and the Convention on Cluster Munitions 13 Meeting of States Parties president.